Hi, I'm Richard McPherson. I'm the Chief Instructor at Let's Ride Motorcycle Training, and in this lesson I'm going to show you the Module 1 Slalom and Figure of 8. Okay, so you've just completed your manual handling exercise, at which point the examiner will ask you to sit onto your bike and then he'll explain the next two exercises, which is the slalom and figure of 8. So straight ahead of you, you'll have 5 yellow cones and 2 blue cones. And the objective is to slalom through the yellows, and you're going to do figure of 8s around the blues. Now, in terms of number of figure of 8s, it's about 2.5, but you don't need to worry about counting. The examiner does all that for you. All you got to do is focus on doing figure of 8s. That being said, do keep an eye on the examiner. Watch out for him waving his clipboard at you, because I have seen a few people over the years who are so focused on doing figure of 8s, they totally miss the examiner waving at them furiously to come over, and they carry on doing figure of 8s. So as I say, do keep an eye out and be ready to pull in next to the examiner. Okay, now this is probably the hardest exercise, I think. It's certainly in my eyes on the Module 1 test, particularly if you use our local test centre, Poole, because Poole is slightly uphill and it's on a slight gradient to the right. And luckily our practice car park here has almost exactly the same gradient, albeit the opposite direction, so it's good practice here. Now, if you're going to be doing your Module 1 test at one of the multi-purpose test centres, those are fabulous. They're lovely, high grip, black top, totally flat and level, so they're fantastic. Whereas the Poole one is a little bit more challenging. I mean, it's not too much to worry about, but it's certainly a little bit more challenging than you'll find at the multi-purpose test centre. Now, the critical stage of this exercise is straight off the bat, the first segment between the yellow cones. If you get that wrong, it's just recipe for disaster for the rest of the exercises. So this is the stage you've got to get absolutely right. Let me just walk you through it. Now, first thing I would say here is take your time to start. Just because the examiner's finished doing his briefing doesn't mean you have to go straight away. So if it was me, I might just take a few seconds just to focus on what I have to do, just try and get myself nice and relaxed before I pull off, and then do it. So we're ready to go. We do those all-round observations, so good obvious check over both sides of you, and then off we go. Now, in terms of control of the bike, it doesn't really matter how you do it as long as you do it. So the way to fail this exercise is knocking one of the cones over, or losing balance and have a heavy foot down. Now, on the subject of feet down, let's talk about that, because you might get away with it. If you've gone a little bit weird and you instinctively put a foot down, even though the bike didn't really topple over, you may well get away with that. So don't automatically assume you failed. So if your foot does hit the deck, get it straight back up and carry on with the exercise. Do the best you can, because you might get away with it. It has to be a pretty heavy foot down for you to fail the test. So the examiner has to look at the situation and think, if he didn't put his foot down, the bike would have fallen over. Okay, so just bear that in mind. As I said, this is the critical stage right here. Now, what you really need to do here is get into this first segment as early as you can without knocking over this first cone. Now, your toes, get them tucked into the frame of the bike. If they're stuck out like flagpoles, they can come along and demolish a cone. Remember, the test cones are slightly taller than these ones even. They're about there. So they certainly go over the height of the foot peg. So you want to get into this first segment as early as you can without taking out this cone. And then you want to do shallow turns. People think, wow, I think what I'll do is I'll come out nice and wide. It gives you a lot more space. Well, yes, but it also means you've got to go full lock to get into the next segment. And what you'll find then, it just amplifies and amplifies until you have to turn so tight you'll lose balance of the bike. So shallow turns are the way here. So come in from the right hand side. Another thing I see people do is come in from this side. Not entirely sure why. It's much easier just to come in from the right hand side and go through these yellows as early as you can, and then turn. And keep it shallow. So I'm keeping it shallow, keeping it tight to this cone, ready for the next segment. If I come out really wide, yes, gives me more space between the cones, but then I've got to do a real tight turn to get back in again. So keep it shallow without knocking over the cones. So what you're going to do with bike control, now the way I like to do it is mainly clutch. So the throttle is going to stay reasonably constant, around about sort of 2,500 to 3,000 revs on the bigger machines. And the clutch is going to be my primary speed control. I'm not going to have it all the way out, I'm not going to have it all the way in. Maintaining drive throughout the whole exercise keeps the bike nicely balanced. If you shut the power off, the bike's going to slow down, and it could get to a point where the bike will topple and you've got to put your foot down. So always maintain drive. What I would suggest, if you find yourself going a little bit quick, rather than shutting the power off to the back wheel, put some pressure on the foot brake. So predominantly a clutch exercise, but if I find myself going a little bit fast, particularly on the figure of 8, but particularly in pull, when you're effectively going uphill, downhill, we can use a bit of foot brake as well just to regulate the speed. Now, as I say, there are various techniques to it. That's just the way I prefer. Some people like to do it with just the throttle, which it's doable, but you've got to be super careful, particularly with the big bikes. Those throttles are very, very responsive, so you've got to have super good throttle control to do it simply on throttle. It's much better using the clutch to control the power here. Some people like to drag the foot brake, so the throttle stays constant, the clutch stays constant, and you're regulating the pressure on the foot brake, so harder to slow down and lighter to speed up a little bit. It doesn't really matter, whatever works for you. So you could try various techniques when you're practicing on your training day, but my technique, what I prefer, is the clutch is the primary control. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter as long as you do the exercise without losing balance or knocking one of the cones over. So this is probably the most critical stage of the test. The rest is pretty straightforward. So let's continue through the cones. So once we've made it through the first segment, just keep going shallow on all the other segments. So my throttle is constant, my clutch is the primary control, bit of foot brake if I'm needing it, and I'm doing nice shallow turns here. And when we get to here, this is effectively the end of the exercise. Now we're going to continue slaloming through the blues as well and then start doing figure of 8s. But they are two separate exercises. They are marked independently of each other. So once you've completed the slalom, these cones don't exist anymore. I mean, you still can't knock them over, but they're not part of the figure of 8. So I'll come back to that in just a moment. But what I'm saying is here, if you think, oh, let's say I've completely messed it up coming into this last segment. So let's say I got wider and wider and wider and wider, and I come into this last segment, just about make it, but the bike's pointing that way. And I'm thinking, how on earth am I going to get between this yellow cone and the first figure of 8 blue cone without going full lock and having all sorts of problems? Well, guess what? We can skip this segment between the yellow and the blue, the first blue. So we can actually come out wide and then come into the figure of 8 from the opposite direction. I mean, normally we would continue slaloming through this section and then straight into the figure of 8, go through the blues and then figure of 8. But this is your get out of jail card right here. So if you come in really late, you're pointing totally the wrong direction, then you can come out nice and wide, come back across and then go through the blues and start your figure of 8. So that's worth knowing, okay? And then once you start the figure of 8, these cones don't exist anymore. All right, as I say, we still can't hit them, but they're not part of the figure of 8. So let's move on to the figure of 8. Okay, so let's say it's all gone really, really well. We don't need to use our get out of jail free card. We continue slaloming. And then once we get to the blues, we don't need to keep the turns as shallow anymore. In fact, don't make the turns as shallow. Make this easy. Don't make this hard. You know, again, another thing I see is people come around to the blues and try and turn like this. There's no way you're going to do that, all right? Don't make it hard. You know, this is not a particularly hard exercise. So it's big circles. And pick up the speed here as well, particularly if you're in pool test centre, because of this camber. We're effectively going uphill, downhill, uphill, downhill. So if you get a little bit slow, there is a danger when you're turning from uphill to downhill that the bike could topple and you've got to put your foot down. It's not so much of an issue on the multi-purpose test centres. You can continue the same speed as you did with the slalom because the surface is totally flat, which is awesome. So let's pick up the pace. So we're going to be doing around about sort of 6 or 7 miles per hour for the slalom. With the figure of 8, we're going to bring that up in pool to sort of 10 to 12 miles per hour and make it nice big circles. So I'm going to come all the way out here. And while I'm doing this, I'm keeping my head turned looking where the cones are. I don't want to be like a blinkered racehorse and look straight ahead because I won't know where I'm going. So nice and wide. And come round. I'm looking where the blue cone is. Come round. Now if I'm going downhill, which I am in this car park, I can use a bit of foot brake here. Come on round. And then through the blues. Now remember what I said earlier about the yellow cones. They're invisible now, apart from you still can't hit them. So we don't necessarily have to go between the blue and the yellow cone here. I mean, if you can, fantastic. It shows nice bike control. So we can come round and go through between the blue and the yellow. But if you, let's say you've just misjudged it a little bit, and you think, oh, how am I going to get between the blue and the yellow cone there? Then guess what? We can go round that yellow cone. That's no problem at all. Go round the yellow if you have to. The second yellow cone, it's probably taking a mick a bit at that one, but the first one, not a problem. I mean, if you're not going tight enough, the examiner's likely just to stop you and just remind you, just bring it in a little bit, okay? But don't make it unnecessarily difficult. And you just basically keep doing figure of eights until the examiner asks you to stop. And that's basically 2.5 figure of eights. So from the moment you double back on yourself, so you come through the blues for the first time, come round, and it's at that point the examiner is going to start counting. So it'll be 1 figure of 8, 2 figure of 8, and then on that second complete one, he'll be waving his clipboard at you, or I think it's an iPad these days, and you'll just ride up next to him, and then you'll stop, and that's it, job done. Okay? So don't make this figure of 8 difficult. It doesn't need to be difficult. Use the space that you have here. All right? So don't make it difficult. You're not going to score any extra points by doing a really, really tight turn here. And the control is exactly the same as the slalom, albeit slightly higher speed, particularly at the pool test centre. So we're aiming for around sort of 10, 12 miles per hour. And the reason we want to do it a little bit faster is that uphill, downhill thing. If we're going really slow at the pool test centre, as we go uphill and turn to go downhill, that's where the bike could topple and then your foot hits the deck. So what could you do to recover? So if, let's say you're at the pool test centre, you're turning and you feel that bike going, what can you do to recover here? Because remember, a heavy foot down is a fail. So there is a way to recover from this. If you feel the bike going, it means you're going too slow. So what we're going to do? Speed up. I mean, don't nail the throttle, but just a little squirt. Okay, it's not going to look pretty, but it's fine. It stops that foot going on the ground there. So a little squirt, the bike will pick itself up again. Okay, it's going to look a bit messy. We can recover from that. And you might pick up a fault for bike control, but that's right. That's all right. We'll take that all day, and then recover it and then bring it back around. And also remember what I said earlier with the slalom. If you do turn it, and it is quite a common thing to happen, your brain has this instinct when you turn the steering to dab your foot on the deck. If that does happen to you, don't assume you failed, okay? Keep the bike rolling, get the foot straight back up onto the pegs. You might get away with it. It's totally the examiner's discretion, but you might find more often than not they'll allow that. As long as the bike hasn't lost control and that foot down has rescued the bike from hitting the deck, it's just simply an instinctive thing of when you turn the steering, then you might get away with it. Okay, so let's move on to a head cam footage of me doing this exercise and you can see what's involved. Okay, so we've got the engine running, we're in gear already, so we do an observation both sides, bit of throttle, bit of clutch, get in this first segment as early as you can without knocking over that first yellow cone. Toes are tucked into the frame of the bike, the clutch is my primary control. I'm doing quick, shallow turns, and once I get to this figure of 8, I'm going to kick the bike out, nice and wide, nice big circles, bit of back brake if I find myself going a little bit quick. Get into the blues quite early, so the examiner is going to be counting now. I'm going between the blue and the yellow, but look how easy I make this. Nice big circles. So that's one complete figure of 8. So let's say on this one we've misjudged it, we're going between the blues a bit late, we think, oh my goodness, how are we going to get between that blue and the yellow? Well, guess what, we can kick it out and go around that yellow. That's no problem at all. Make it easy, nice big circles. And that's the final complete figure of 8. The examiner will be waving at you, you just come to a nice smooth stop right next to him there. Okay, observations both sides. Off we go, bit of throttle, bit of clutch, bit of back brake if we need it. Get into the first segment nice and early, nice quick and shallow turns. Clutch is my primary control. And then once I'm through the blues, bring it out nice and wide, nice big circles now, a bit of back brake if you need it as you're going down the hill here. The examiner will start counting now. So going from between the blue and the yellow, but we can skip around that yellow if we need to. Keeping a bit of speed up. So that's the first complete figure of 8. And we can go around this yellow if we need to, if we've misjudged it. Keeping my head turned, looking where I want to go, keeping the drive going. The examiner will call you in to stop, pointed towards a box of blue cones at the other end of the testing area. Okay, so that's the slalom and figure of 8.